Welcome to Global Risk Community Chat. Today our guest is Anna Lucas. I'm very happy to have you here today, Anna. Welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be in the show. Thank you for having me.
Likewise. So as far as I know, well, today our topic is how banks should be managing climate risks. But before we get into it, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, okay. Well, I have essentially been a corporate banker all my entire career. I started in Portugal, in Banco Montepio, and then I moved to Eastern Europe, and I worked 24 years for ING. I started in former Czechoslovakia, then Slovakia, then I also went to Russia, and then I also went to Austria. So during this time, besides the time I spent in Moscow in the operational risk management team, I basically had always the responsibility for the front office. So I was managing a team of relationship managers and lending specialists, and really putting in place the transactions and the loans for the clients. And so the corporate side of the business was really my responsibility. I did this until 2016. And at that time, I decided that I wanted to do something by myself. And since then, I've been advising SMEs in their requests for financings from banks. So advising them on how to do that, looking at business plans, whether they are bankable or not. And also, more recently, I've published a few online courses on banking, and more recently also on the problematic of sustainability and climate risks and ESG in the financial sector.
Thank you for sharing that. Of course, I hear a lot of international experience, a lot of years of experience in different countries, different subjects. So it's super interesting. So with that being said, of course, you mentioned climate risk, ESG, sustainability. These are all more newer upcoming topics in general, especially for banks, I presume. So how does this really affect banks? What exactly are these climate risks?
Okay, so first we have to understand that the climate risks are divided into two categories. There are the physical risks and the transition risks. The physical risks are perhaps more straightforward to understand, because these are risks that may result in financial losses due to real climate disasters and problems that result from the global issue of the global warming. So there are geographies where you have already had disasters that basically resulted in the loss of lives, or people losing homes either from floods or droughts or wildfires. But you also have many problems in certain areas with pollution, either air pollution or land contamination. So all these issues are obviously disturbing the economic activities in these areas, in these regions, and therefore are very important for banks in terms of disrupting the cash flows of the borrowers and also the assets that the banks might have in exposure in these locations. The transition risks, they are basically risks that can result in financial losses driven from the adjustment process that we are now having because of the goals of the Paris Agreement. So the whole economy, corporates, governments, financial institutions, we are going through a transition period to this net zero economy, or net zero carbon economy. And all this is bringing to all corporates and also to then the bank's borrowers huge challenges in terms of how are they going to reduce their emissions and what will it represent for them. And here we have basically three areas that are important to mention. One is the regulatory and policy area. So a lot of additional regulation and procedures and controls and disclosure obligations are coming to all the corporates and but also governments and financial institutions. So almost every week we are seeing new type of regulation coming up and disclosure obligations, aside of course all the commitments for decreasing the emissions themselves. So regulatory space, a lot of pressure here. Then we have risks that come with change of technology. Perhaps the most talk about subject here is the transition from the fossil fuel industry to the renewables industry, but not only here, we are seeing changes in technology. In many areas of manufacturing, the processes themselves in all the value chain are having to change because we really need to bring the emissions that are generated in these processes down. So a lot of technology effort here with changing the new investments happening. And then we also have changes in the consumer preferences. So more and more we are seeing that consumers are very sensitive to environmental products and services, and this is really driving some companies out of business, the ones that cannot adapt and transition. So all of these areas where cash flows of our borrowers can be disrupted are important for banks, because if cash flows are disrupted, then we might see that the clients do not have the money to repay our loans. And this is what we are really concerned about in the banks.
I hear a lot of risks, actually, a lot of different, aspects involved as well. So considering that, how are banks exactly like managing this risk? How are they, quantifying them or pricing them?
Yeah, so this is where things get obviously more complicated and challenging and difficult, really, because nothing of this, so analyzing these risks and quantifying them will never be possible without a very close collaboration with the clients themselves. There is a lot of data that we need to gather as banks regarding the emissions that our clients are generating, because also these are as banks, our financed emissions. So it's our role in all this problem that is at stake. So we really need to go as bankers client by client, and definitely sector by sector, because the transition varies a lot sector by sector. Obviously, in sectors that are much more emission intensive, the work will be more difficult. But basically, banks will have to understand what each company is doing in terms of the transition path. So many companies are having already their carbon pledges, their carbon neutral pledges, even, or targets in emission reduction up to certain dates. So we as bankers, we need to understand what targets these are, and have a view whether they make sense, whether they are realistic, because there is a huge risk already as time goes by. The risk increases that these commitments that have been done by corporates, so by our borrowers, will not be realized and executed. So there is a lot of talk about the emissions gap and how difficult it is to, and how realistic it might be to reach net zero by 2050, as we have in the Paris Agreement. And if these commitments are not done, then the borrowers, the companies, are really facing probably additional fines or penalties, or reputational risks. Also, the problem that the pricing of carbon, so the pricing of pollution, is increasing as time goes by. So we have to be careful as banks if our borrowers are not having in their balance sheets some hidden potential financial liabilities that come with the fact that in the future maybe they will have to offset emissions that they are not able to reduce organically, and the price of these offsets is going up. So there is a lot of things that can happen in the corporate world that will disturb those cash flows, and then compromise maybe the capacity of our borrowers to repay our loans.
Thank you for sharing that as well. I think it's super valuable to, know about, this end of the things too. So before we end up, I want to ask one last question, and that is, what would be your takeaway points for our audience?
Yeah. Well, I think that the most important thing is to really realize and accept that the climate risks are financial risks. climate risks can really translate into financial losses for the corporates that are our borrowers, and therefore also for the banks. So we can no longer, as banks, ignore this fact and just think that this is just something that we have time and we don't really need to spend some time on this. This is not really the thing that we should be doing now. We have to take this as bankers very, very seriously and really start to speak with our borrowers, collaborating with them, understanding their path to transition, understanding where they can be hit by regulatory pressure, where they can be hit by additional investments and costs they will have to do to be more or less carbon intensive. So in terms of investments that they have to do, these are all additional costs that come to the corporations to be aligned with regulation, to be more greener in their whole value chain. And maybe the other thing where I spoke now really about value chain, because we can also not forget that we are also not looking at our corporates as a standalone business, but we have to analyze these risks also within their value chain, because if their suppliers are disrupted by any climate disaster or they are unable to fulfill the regulatory pressure, then they will also themselves be disturbed, and that will affect our borrowers as well. So we really need to go client by client and helping them, but also collaborating with them. And then finally, very important, we need as banks to analyze these risks and make our decisions in terms of our portfolio management, how we see that these risks are affecting our borrowers in terms of their risk, and then make decisions about, are we going to reprice these loans? Do we need to put more capital aside for them? And do we need to divest from certain industries or corporates that we see that indeed are not ready and are going into the wrong direction as opposed to the goals of the Paris Agreement? So a lot of very, very important and crucial decisions here for banks at the moment because of these new climate risks.
Thank you so much for sharing that as well. I hope all the audience that might be in the banking are actually taking notes. So thank you so much for yeah, I hope so too. So thank you so much for joining us today, sharing this topic. It's not an angle that we hear often about, from that bank's angle. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you as well. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah, have a nice day.
You too.